The first time Hope dared to enter the palace, it tiptoed. A discreet cluster of women changed their gait around the queen. A chaplain lingered a moment longer at the doorway after Mass. The physician's pulse quickened at his own counts and then settled into professional caution. It was early 1804, the season when Madrid remembers that spring exists, and the household began to speak in the grammar of if. Preparations were practical at first. A lying-in chamber identified, curtains pinned to soften light, a list of godparents drafted in pencil. Midwives compared notes about air and calm and the necessity of keeping visitors out. The court, which cannot live without visitors, promised to try. Obstetrics in that era was honest about its limits. The best minds prescribed rest, avoided agitation, and prayed that Providence would do the part no handbook could. Laudanum, already a delicate tool in the palace, became a companion, measured in drops, then in spoonfuls, to quiet nausea, to ease the iron bands that sometimes clenched around the queen's abdomen, to quiet the mind's running ahead of the body. The physicians argued softly over baths and broths, over the right elevation of pillows, over whether reading aloud calmed or excited the maternal spirits. The ladies, who had grown expert in the geometry of comfort, learned a new geometry. How many steps from bed to prayer stool before breath shortened? How long a visit might be before smiles began to strain? In the 4th month, the bleeding started. The palace heard it not as a fact, but as a change in sound. The way a corridor's murmur flattens when a door opens onto bad news. There is no elegant way to write about what followed. The body makes its own prose. Physicians were called at an hour that insults clocks. Remedies were tried with the humility born of experience, stillness, compresses, whispered encouragements that were for the heart as much as for the womb. When the inevitable arrived, it did so with clinical finality and human wreckage. The notation entered the ledger in the smallest possible hand, abortus, as if a smaller word could make a smaller grief. Grief, when it cannot be spoken in the square, leaks through the machinery of the household. Candles burned lower in the chapel. The Queen's music was put away without comment. The prince returned from rides with mud on his boots and an expression that was not anger so much as rehearsed control. Laudanum, so faithful, so treacherous, stayed. What had been a measured comfort to endure ritualized nights now became a measured comfort to endure empty days. The ladies counted the drops with vigilance that would have done credit to a garrison, and still the arithmetic slipped. For the first time, the Queen's hand shook when she signed something unimportant. Ferdinand's response followed the only map he trusted: order the elements. If chance would not obey, perhaps the calendar would. He demanded charts, lunar, astrological, even agricultural, as if cycles that govern tides might be persuaded to govern luck. An astronomer, embarrassed by the task but flattered by the access, drew up schedules with dignified nonsense, auspicious hours marked for conjugal tranquility, inauspicious ones shaded as if storm warnings. The court, which had long ago learned to dress expedients in the clothes of tradition, consented to the masquerade. Then came the implements. What had begun, before marriage, as accommodations reappeared as solutions. The master saddler's family established a workshop rhythm that would one day be passed down like a recipe. Cut, bind, test, revise. The words on the orders kept their chapel tones: supports, braces, straps, while the private instructions spoke bluntly about positioning and restraint. No one wished to hurt anyone. Everyone wished to avoid chaos. The queen, pious and brave and frightened, submitted to contrivances whose purpose was to make bearable what had shown itself capable of becoming unbearable. Her laudanum dose crept upward, first to quiet the body, then to quiet the memory of the body. Courts love confidence artists for the same reason deserts love mirages. A mystic arrived, introduced by a nobleman who owed someone a favor. An itinerant physician presented diagrams of channels in which energy, once coaxed, would behave. A Neapolitan swore that a sequence of prayers and postures copied from a missionary's letter would set aright what pride and doubt had twisted. The chapel gave them toleration, but not endorsement. The doctors gave them civility, but not assent. The prince gave them coin, and after each failure, a shorter temper. The palace, at night, began to smell like incense and camphor. In the day, like disappointment scrubbed away. In 1805, the belly swelled again. Joy, chastened, did not dare call itself by name, but the household's gait altered once more. The queen's complexion improved. Her letters home acquired a new steadiness of handwriting. Physicians congratulated each other with the reserve of men who know what can go wrong. The city, always listening for news it has no right to, put away its cruelties for a few weeks. Ministers spoke of unity and timing. The prince's charts were folded and put aside as if God had been persuaded by arithmetic after all. Complications began late, when confidence is most dangerous. The pains that should have meant progress meant instead a warning that the room understood too slowly. Blood and panic argue the same case. The doctors, competent and exhausted, organize their calm around them. In a more modern century, someone might have cut decisively, transfused, sterilized, commanded infection to stay its hand. In 1805, knowledge and instruments lagged behind courage. The labor became an ordeal that left the queen white with a fatigue that made the laudanum bottle look like mercy itself. The child, so fiercely imagined by so many, died before the imagining could acquire a name. Something in the queen broke that day that no sacrament could solder. Prayer did not stop. It changed. The confessor found her bent longer over the rail, muttering not in accusation, but in a kind of accounting. Sins she could name, sins she could not. Offenses that might appease a God who seemed to be telling her body what it was allowed to hold. Laudanum, savior, thief, moved from night ritual to day companion. Servants learned to watch pupils and lids. Ladies learned to keep conversation light enough to float, but not so light it drifted into madness. The queen began, at times, to look through people rather than at them. Even music, once a refuge, sometimes set her trembling, as if melody could call back contractions. Ferdinand hardened further. The logic was ruinous and simple. If pain returns when one fails to control enough variables, control more. The straps grew more elaborate, the schedules stricter, the room more crowded with what could be arranged, because what could not be arranged had humiliated him twice. He did not accuse the queen to her face. His cruelty seldom took the shape of direct insult, but the air in the room told on him. He suspected faintness of will in others because he had been taught to despise faintness in himself. He began to speak of sabotage as if disgust were a doctrine and not a wound. The ladies took to praying for nights to pass without incident. The physicians took to drafting, then never sending, memoranda about limits. And then, in May 1807, at 21, the queen died. The official bulletin said fever and delicacy. words that courts cultivate because they make death sound like etiquette. The private letters of women who loved her say exhaustion of the soul. The palace supplied prayers and black cloth. Madrid supplied murmurs. Rumor, always waiting for assignment, received one. Some said poison, others neglect. A few, angry at the crown in more ways than one, said Godoy's long shadow had found a new shape. The most persistent tale concerned the apothecary, discovered dead in his chamber days after the funeral, a letter seized by officials, meanings extracted by men whose chief skill was extracting meanings. No proof survives that would satisfy a stern historian. Proof is not what rumors eat. They eat grievance, coincidence, and the pleasure of thinking one knows a secret no one can punish you for whispering. What can be said without embroidery is that the queen went into the ground while still almost a girl, and that a household already lung-sick with caution developed a new cough. Suspicion as policy. The prince moved through the prescribed poses of mourning with accuracy, perhaps even with sincerity. Sincerity, in palaces, rarely survives inspection. Within weeks, inquiries were made, quiet, efficient, about a second marriage, with the added criterion that would not be written in any protocol: fertility proven. The physicians, drafting new schedules, no one should have to draft twice, tried to imagine fresh ways to moderate the old problem. The saddler's grandson cut leather with a precision that felt like guilt. The country, which had briefly permitted itself to hope that a cradle would do what a constitution could not, returned to its habit of reading the weather by palace windows. The courtiers, who had mastered the art of being furniture, learned a new stillness. The doctors, who had failed without disgrace, prepared to fail again with dignity. Somewhere in a lower corridor, a servant boy told the story of the seized letter to a scullery girl, and she told it to her aunt, and by the time it reached the market, it had sprouted names, dosages, motives, a saint's day, a witness, and a moral. Thus a private catastrophe became public temperament. The palace had tried to turn suffering into duty. It had succeeded only in turning grief into governance. And grief, enthroned, does what all sovereign grief does. It makes surveillance feel like prudence, and blame sound like truth. From the hush of mourning dresses and locked cabinets, the palace slid toward a new vocabulary: plots. The same corridors that had ferried cushions and corked vials now carried folded notes from grandees who decided that a prince forged in humiliation could be honed into a weapon. They called themselves by many names, but history remembers one label best: the Fernandinos. Men who detested Godoy as an embarrassment to Spain and who believed, or pretended to believe, that salvation lay in replacing a favorite with a son. They dressed calculation as filial piety. Ferdinand, they said in salons and carriage interiors, was el deseado, the desired one, the antidote to a court ruled by a queen's partialities and a guardsman's ambitions. The pamphleteers who had mocked the favorite now praised the prince's prudence with the same ink and almost the same sentences. They looked at Ferdinand and saw not a young man drifting inside his private storm, but a banner. Banners do not complain. Banners wave where they are carried. The men who courted him did not ask for tenderness. They asked for usefulness. They taught him the secret handshake of conspiracies, coded visits, mirrored phrases, silences calibrated to the length of a prayer. They whispered of a Spain restored by his mere arrival in the council chamber, of reforms that would rinse the kingdom clean of favoritism and farce. They promised him a future in which no one would ever laugh at him again. What they did not say, because conspirators never say it aloud, was that a prince who had learned to keep lists of slights could be taught to keep lists of enemies. Europe's map felt the tremor. In October 1707, while diplomats inked the Treaty of Fontainebleau to permit French troops passage through Spain against Portugal, French columns began to enter the country like a polite invasion. Ministers told the people this was strategy. Innkeepers watching boots and bayonets knew better. In that same tense month, the conspiracy around Ferdinand compressed into what posterity calls the El Escorial affair. Letters, meetings, the prince's appeal to Napoleon's favor, whether naive, desperate, or cynical. Even his supporters could not agree. Then came discovery, which in courts looks like a door opening at the worst possible time. Papers were found, names assembled. The rumor mill sharpened its blades. Brought before his father's authority and his mother's stare, the prince performed the saddest maneuver of a cornered courtier. Confession as survival. He wrote with a pen that might as well have been a knife, naming men who had risked everything for his imagined future, mapping conversations, begging forgiveness with a flood of detail that could drown allies. He called himself dutiful son and blamed the currents that had carried him. He wept where it was useful to weep. He survived. His friends did not. Some were jailed, some exiled to the edges of a kingdom already fraying. Others discovered, too late, that the prince they had tried to sculpt into a savior was still the boy who believed safety could be purchased with someone else's pain. If there is a point in the story when affection for Ferdinand curdles into wary pity, it is here. He had learned to trade loyalty like a coin, because loyalty, in his childhood, had been a costume that could be changed in a hallway. But conspiracies are rarely killed by a single confession. They are hydras, and the knife only grows heads. The court staggered forward into 1808, the air full of drums and rumors. French troops, already deeper in Spain than any treaty's polite phrases could justify, made the presence of empire felt with bivouacs and requisitions. Godoy, reading the weather with his usual mixture of accuracy and self-interest, urged the royal family to retreat south, first to Seville, then perhaps to the sea. And the people heard in that advice an echo of cowardice. Madrid's patience snapped not with a speech, but with a riot. Anger dresses itself faster than etiquette. At Aranjuez, in March, the palace complex that had housed so many spring pleasures became a stage for an ugly education. Crowds surged. Windows broke. The favorite, so long the lightning rod for a nation's grievances, was dragged from his refuge and beaten with the intimacy that mobs reserve for famous men. Soldiers tried to restrain popular justice and discovered that uniforms do not always confer legitimacy. In the chaos, the royal family learned how quickly favor turns to fear when the people decide they have been made a joke. Charles IV, faced with the spectacle of a capital that would not forgive and a court that would not defend, abdicated in favor of his son. Abdications always sound like magnanimity in bulletins and like abandonment in private rooms. Ferdinand became king not by healing the body politic, but by replacing a figure the body had rejected. There were cheers, many meant them, and a brief, intoxicating belief that dynastic arithmetic had solved a moral equation. The new monarch rode through streets still smelling of broken wood and rage, and the shout of El Deseado bounced off facades like a benediction. For a heartbeat, Spain believed it had turned a page. Then history found a new way to humiliate everyone. Napoleon, whose columns already laced Spain like a net, invited father and son to Bayonne under the varnish of arbitration. Arbitration presumes two parties and a referee. This meeting offered one will and two victims. In the Basque air, heavy with French certainty, the Bourbons were induced, bullied is the more honest verb, into a double abdication that passed the crown from son back to father, and from father to emperor in a neat legal braid. Paper can move faster than loyalties. When the braid was cut, Joseph Bonaparte, polite and earnest and disastrously foreign, was seated where a Spanish king had sat. What did Ferdinand feel as the scepter slipped, bureaucratically, from his hand? The records give us formulas. The diaries give us silences. We can say he tasted, under the legalese, the same flavor he had known since boyhood. Power is a corridor of doors other people open and close. He had reached the throne and found it as furnished as his private chambers. Apparatus everywhere, agency rationed, the night's proceedings designed by others. He had believed, for a month, that the crowd's shout would drown out his own internal chorus of scorn and fear. Bayonne taught him that applause is not armor. Spain erupted. Cities that had cheered a son now cursed an emperor. Provinces muttered ancient words like junta and fueros and then spoke them aloud. The smell of cordite replaced the smell of incense. The de Mayo uprising would soon baptize the century in the kind of blood that pamphlets cannot drink dry. But for the moment, our story sits with the Prince-King prisoner who had imagined that changing who sat in the chair would change the shape of the room. He was learning a lesson that would mark every gesture of his restored reign. When humiliation becomes your most fluent language, you will eventually speak it to a nation. Those who had hailed him El Deseado began revising their adjectives with the speed familiar to courtiers. Those who had invested their hopes in his not being Godoy discovered that negatives do not govern. The very nobles who had coaxed him toward disloyalty watched him perfect the logic they had modeled. Use what you need, discard what you must, survive. He had betrayed them in October to save himself. In Bayonne, he discovered a power capable of betraying both of them at once. Yet even here, amid the wreckage of honor and legitimacy, the machinery of palaces tried to do what palaces always try to do: reset. Bulletins were drafted, signatures chased seals. The physics of etiquette reasserted itself over the chemistry of rage. Ferdinand, now a royal captive in all but name, rehearsed the expressions appropriate to a sovereign without a throne: dignity, grievance, a piety that insisted on providence when politics had failed. He would be sent north to a French chateau with carpets and constraints to experience the most corrosive humiliation of all, being studied by doctors and diplomats who considered him an object. But that is the next chamber. For now, the lesson of 1807 to 1808 is cruel in its symmetry. In private, the prince had learned that when fear is strong enough, you hand other people the rope and tell yourself that binding is safety. In public, Spain learned that when fear is strong enough, you hand other countries the keys and tell yourself that arbitration is honor. Both bindings left marks that would only darken with time. They sent him north with the polite cruelty of empires, not in chains, never that, for appearances matter even to conquerors, but in a carriage whose doors closed with the smooth conviction of inevitability. The road unrolled past monasteries and market towns, out of his language, and into another, until the milestones began to whisper Valençay. The chateau belonged to Talleyrand, a man who collected influence the way others collect clocks, with delicate hands and a talent for keeping everything ticking. There, in that carefully arranged quiet, Spain's king without a throne would be kept, guest by title, prisoner by design. Captivity in Valençay did not resemble dungeons. It resembled good manners. Rooms with tall windows, carpets that coaxed footsteps into discretion, gardens symmetrical enough to make a homesick heart feel scolded. The air smelled of polished wood and hedges disciplined into right angles. Guards wore courtesy like livery. A steward explained the hours for walks. A chef took pride in menus that suggested prosperity without reminding the guest that prosperity belonged to another crown. The message housed in all that grace was simple. Your kingdom can be administered as tastefully as this room, and by someone else. Ferdinand learned the new choreography as quickly as he had learned old humiliations. Promenades at set times, chess with men whose smiles never reached their eyes, letters drafted under the supervision of officials who praised his penmanship. He was supplied with books, pious, historical, harmless, and kept from newspapers, which are dangerous because they let men imagine themselves in the world. The physicians arrived on schedule with the softness of professional curiosity, and for the first time in years, the man who had been treated as a secret at home became, abroad, a case. French doctors write differently than Spanish ones. Their notebooks enjoyed the crispness of an age that believed classification could rescue suffering from myth. They took pulses and measurements with a politeness that warmed itself at the fire of science. They asked questions that had frightened Iberian colleagues into euphemism and recorded answers that sounded, even in translation, like a man trying to make peace with his own proportions. Examination drifted toward study. Study drifted toward fascination. A sovereign whose body had forced a palace into ritual now offered Parisian medicine a footnote for lectures, a specimen wrapped in protocol. They were not monsters. They were men who believed knowledge was a kind of mercy. But mercy wears different faces on different days. Some afternoons, Valençay felt like a clinic. Other afternoons, like a salon held over the human being at its center. A physician sketched a diagram, neat as an architect, and afterward bowed so elegantly you could almost forget the sketch existed. Another, younger and awkward, stammered a question about comfort as if pronouncing a heresy. Even this consideration stung. Ferdinand, who had trained himself to survive humiliation by controlling furniture, could control nothing here except the tempo of his breath. Talleyrand, limping, smiling, smooth as lacquer, visited when it suited him and when Paris required proof that courtesy had been paid. His conversation wrapped needles in silk. He spoke of weather and connoisseurship, of a hothouse peach's perfection, of music recently performed in a private room where no one listened too hard. Beneath the layers lay the reality he did not need to state. France has made you a fact among its furnishings. He did not gloat. Men who truly possess power do not need to gloat. He simply tuned the air so that even kindness sounded like a receipt. Meanwhile, Spain burned and bled. News reached the chateau in fragments, like light slipping through shutters. Uprisings in Madrid, de Mayo baptizing the streets, victory at Bailén, startling all of Europe, vengeance marching back with French eagles. Zaragoza starved, then battered, then starved again. Juntas forming in cities that remembered the old words for self-government. British redcoats appearing like a rumor that grew legs, Wellington learning the map with terrible patience. The Cádiz Cortes opened their debates across the water, and in 1812, a constitution, liberal, modern, implausibly brave, announced itself to a nation that was learning to fight with its fingernails. Ferdinand heard about these things the way one hears about weather in other countries. The French minders curated his reality to protect both him and themselves from inconvenient facts. He petitioned, politely and often, for more news, for the comfort of correspondence beyond the approved list, for the relief of confession to anyone who would not translate it into a report. Denied, he returned to the habit that had sustained him since boyhood: letters. He wrote to European courts with the solemnity of a man making inventories. Vague laments wrapped requests for matches, wives whose families would like a king in name, if not in practice, and who, perhaps, would not make him feel like a problem under review. The letters were careful. He had learned caution at birth, and yet breathless in their own way. They promised piety, continuity, allegiance to old forms. They promised that a restored Ferdinand would be a wall against contagions drifting from Paris. Constitutions, assemblies, the dangerous idea that subjects have opinions. And threaded through the diplomatic politesse ran the same private arithmetic that had moved him in Madrid. If a marriage could be arranged, an heir might be named. If an heir could be named, a hostage could be exchanged with the future. His people starved. He bartered with tomorrow. At Valençay, he discovered the special agony of powerless men. Time, days extended with the elasticity of an unpricked balloon. He became conscientious about habits. He prayed, not longer than in Madrid, but with steadier syllables. He read manuals of kingship that assumed a king could hear himself think. He walked the gravel paths with a dignified pace tuned to the rhythm of military boots behind him. He kept his temper because temper would have been a plaything tossed back into his hands by satisfied captors. He performed, in short, the imperial theater's favorite part, the sovereign who makes captivity look like a retreat. The physicians took their turns in this theater too. Without the constraint of Spanish protocol, and encouraged by a professional culture that prized frank description, they recorded what they had once only suspected, that his condition enlarged itself into new difficulties with years, that solutions proposed by artisans in Madrid had been acts of tenderness rather than cures, that the psychology of such a life could not be separated from its mechanics. One wrote, almost apologetically, that His Catholic Majesty's dignity exceeded his ease. Another appended a note on affect, a word that, in that era, held both emotion and outward bearing. The royal patient possessed an admirable affect, they said, and an interior life troublé. Scientific French-making of a man, a weather report. Rumors from home penetrated anyway. Servants talk across borders the way rivers cross them. Couriers share more than satchels. Ferdinand understood, without anyone needing to say it, that loyalty was being reconceived in his absence, not as obedience to a person, but as adherence to a cause. The very men who rallied at first to El Deseado now rallied to La Nación. Spaniards, in the plural, learned to say the word with a pride that no palace could orchestrate. It stung. He had always believed that fidelity required a body to lean toward, the monarchy's great promise and great hazard. Now, a parchment in Cádiz claimed to receive oaths once reserved for sovereigns. He wrote, in one of his letters, that such experiments were admirable in novels and fatal in kingdoms. The sentence reads, brave and tired at once. If captivity softened him, it did it the way water softens stone, slowly, by insisting. He stopped bothering to correct courtesies that weren't quite right. He memorized the pattern of the parquet, as if certainties could be stored underfoot. He became exacting about small rituals, the angle at which a chair must receive him, the number of steps between his desk and the window. When the doctors knocked, he welcomed them with the urbanity of a host receiving guests he had not invited. He tried, disastrously and sincerely, to believe that order could be stitched from manners. At night, when the chateau withdrew into its own silence and only the mice rehearsed revolutions in the walls, he sometimes rehearsed conversations with the men of Cádiz he had not met. He practiced arguments against liberties that presumed equal souls. He practiced fatherly phrases about the people's needs. He practiced confessions to God about the people's rage. He would sway the Cortes with gravity. He would compromise where conscience permitted. He would leave certain articles undecided for the comfort of all. In these visions, the nation was a room, and he could still arrange its furniture. But letters written in captivity travel as slowly as mercy. He remained in his gilded quarantine while Spain invented itself around him in blood, paper, and song. In the spring of 1812, when the Constitution was proclaimed, he paced Valençay's gravel and felt, with a clarity that arrived like a fever breaking, that what had been taken from him in Bayonne was not only a chair, but a vocabulary. He would return. Yes, he practiced return as a posture the way he had once practiced prayer. And he would carry with him the memory of being made an object. Objects survive by becoming operators. It is a dangerous conversion. When the French Empire began to shudder, the shutters at Valençay unlatched by degrees. Dispatches from Paris adopted a tone that did not exactly apologize and did not exactly command. Napoleon's diplomats rephrased yesterday's necessities as today's magnanimities. To release the Bourbon would be to tidy a ledger. Papers were drawn with the calm haste bureaucrats achieve when history forces their hand. In 1814, the door opened outward. He left as he had arrived, with ceremony, with self-control, with a private weather that no one else could read. The gardens, perfectly indifferent, kept their lines. The physicians bowed their professional bows. The steward made a small inventory of linens and candlesticks, and the dignity of a house preserved against the noise of events. Ferdinand stepped into the carriage that would take him home, to the roar of a country that had fought for an idea while he had fought for composure. The difference would matter. The difference would, before long, devour the Constitution, bruise the loyal, and teach Spain that restoration is a word that can mean repair or reversion, depending on who holds the pen. On the last curve of the drive, he did not look back. Captivity had taught him to conserve gestures. He would need all of them where he was going.